Every story holds a secret. But some secrets are so deep and dark that understanding them becomes a lifetime of pain. Within the walls of Harrington House lay a silence so profound. It had been hidden for years. A terrifying truth that, if revealed, could unravel not only a family's legacy, but also a long-buried death. For decades, no one had known a single piece of it. But now the time has come to face the horrifying truth. Are you ready to confront a secret so powerful that it destroyed lives in its wake? The village of Little Wham lay sprawled in a patchwork of rolling hills, its timeless charm hidden behind the soft curtain of green that draped over its sloping fields. The thatched roofs of its cottages, nestled in neat rows, stood like quiet sentinels, their gardens alive with the last blooms of summer. It was a place so serene, so seemingly perfect, that it almost whispered a lie, because as Miss Marple knew too well, behind such tranquility, there were always secrets buried deep, waiting for someone to uncover. As her carriage approached the quaint Redden house, she felt an odd chill in the air, a subtle tension that lingered even in the golden sunlight. Margaret Redden, her dear old friend, was waiting on the porch, a warm, welcoming smile on her face, but her eyes, sharp as ever, held something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "Jane, my dear, it's been far too long," she said, enveloping her in a hug that, though affectionate, felt just a touch too stiff. Stepping inside, Miss Marple's trained gaze swept the room. It was as charming as she had expected, yet something was amiss, a heaviness in the air that settled in the pit of her stomach. Margaret poured tea with the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. "There's something you should know about this village," she said quietly, her voice low enough to suggest that whatever she was about to reveal was something the village had long tried to forget. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately, though her sharp eyes glimmered with understanding. That evening, Margaret took her to the vicarage, where a handful of village women gathered for their weekly tea. The conversation was stilted at best, filled with the polite chatter that one would expect in such a place. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, the villagers were masking something far darker. As the vicar's wife, Mrs. Dunley, poured tea with brisk efficiency, the nervous fluttering of Dorothy Lane's hands didn't go unnoticed by Miss Marple. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she observed the housekeeper, who seemed as if she were trying desperately to keep her composure. The mention of Violet Harrington's disappearance was almost casual, too casual. But to Miss Marple, it was a key that had just unlocked the door to a room she had been waiting to open. "It's been 30 years, hasn't it?" Mrs. Dunley asked in a hushed tone, her lips tight, betraying a flicker of discomfort. 30 years since Violet vanished, and not a trace ever found. The words hung in the air like a haunting refrain, and Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes sharp. "Did she run away?" she asked gently, but her voice carried an undertone that suggested she already knew the answer. The silence that followed was thick, laden with the weight of unspoken truths. Dorothy Lane's fingers trembled as they gripped her teacup, and for a moment, Miss Marple could have sworn she saw a flash of panic cross the woman's face. There was more to this story, far more than the villagers were willing to admit, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The garden of the vicarage was immaculate, as always, its rose beds perfect, its stone pathways impeccably swept. But when the old gardener, Mr. Bess, dug near the ivy-clad wall that morning, his spade struck something unexpected, a small metallic object. The locket, delicate and engraved with the initials, VH, lay in his palm like a forgotten relic. Miss Marple turned the locket over in her hands, her sharp eyes noting every detail, every hint that might lead her to the truth. "Violet Harrington," she murmured. The locket had been buried beneath the ivy, far from where it should have been. "Strange place for it to end up," Miss Marple commented, her voice steady, but her mind was racing. This was no accident, and the village's perfect image was crumbling around her. Perhaps she lost it, Dorothy Lane suggested too quickly, her voice betraying her unease. The way her knuckles whitened as she clutched her shawl told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. This was no lost trinket, and Violet Harrington's disappearance was far from the simple mystery it had been made out to be. Something terrible had happened here, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. As the villagers whispered in the background, Miss Marple's thoughts turned cold and methodical. One clue had been revealed, and she would not stop until every dark secret this village held was brought into the light. As the evening sky stretched into deep hues of purple and gold, a strange chill seemed to settle over the village of Little Bew. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the familiar path to Redden House. The once tranquil village, now marked by an unsettling atmosphere, seemed to hold its breath as secrets long buried began to resurface. The locket, a small delicate thing wrapped in layers of dust and time, was now heavy in her pocket, a simple object, yet it had stirred up more than it had any right to. 30 years had passed since Violet Harrington had vanished into the shadows, her disappearance marked by whispers and unspoken words. But now, the locket had reappeared, and with it, a flood of old memories and unresolved mysteries. As Miss Marple walked beside Margaret, the silence between them spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't the typical quiet of a village at dusk. No, this was different. It was a silence laced with discomfort, the kind that only comes when something deeply troubling is being kept hidden. Margaret, though always composed, couldn't quite mask the unease in her posture, the way her hands fidgeted with the teacup, and how her eyes darted around the room, never settling too long on any one thing. The walls of Redden House, which had once felt warm and inviting, now seemed to close in on them. She served the tea in silence, but Miss Marple could sense that the heavy weight of the locket was causing Margaret to rethink the stories she had once believed about Violet's disappearance. "It's been 30 years, Jane," Margaret finally said, her voice wavering ever so slightly. 30 years since Violet disappeared, and for all that time we thought we had made peace with it. But now this locket." She trailed off, her words barely a whisper. "It changes everything." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her eyes glimmering with the quiet wisdom that always seemed to see more than what was apparent. She did not respond immediately, knowing that in moments like this, it was better to let the silence speak. Margaret's discomfort was not new. It was the same unease Miss Marple had felt when she had first laid eyes on the locket, the same feeling that crept over her whenever she thought of Violet's last night. The locket was not just an object. It was a clue. It was the thread that had been tied tightly around the mystery for decades, and now it had been pulled loose. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the past pressing in on them both. The villagers had lived with this ghost of Violet's disappearance for far too long, but now the veil was being lifted. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of evening rituals, seemed eerily still as Margaret set the teapot down with more force than necessary, as if trying to suppress her growing frustration. Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the last traces of daylight clung to the horizon, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something in her friend's face that wasn't there before. Fear. It was subtle, but it was there. Fear of the past being unearthed, of secrets being dragged into the light. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, allowing her knitting needles to click rhythmically in the otherwise silent room. The truth, as she had learned many times before, was a force that couldn't be ignored forever, and the villagers of Little Wood would soon find that out for themselves. "The past is never truly gone, Margaret," Miss Marple finally said, her voice soft yet filled with an unshakable certainty. "It leaves traces, and those traces have a way of finding their way back when we least expect it." Margaret sighed, a sound that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than her years. "I thought we'd moved past it," she murmured, more to herself than to Miss Marple. "But now, it's as if Violet never left at all. It's like the village is holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed." Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the flickering flames of the fire, her mind already racing ahead, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for far too long. "People do not fear the unknown, Margaret. No, they fear the truth, and sometimes, the truth is far more dangerous than any mystery." As the evening stretched on, the village outside remained quiet, its usual hum replaced by an uneasy stillness. Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the village was, in a way, holding its breath along with Margaret, waiting for something to happen, for the past to catch up with them all. She knew it wasn't just the locket that had resurfaced. It was the specter of Violet herself, and whatever happened next would change everything. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Miss Marple made her way toward Harrington House. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered by time, yet standing tall and imposing. The estate had always been a place of mystery and grandeur, and now, with Violet's disappearance still hanging over it like a dark cloud, it felt more like a fortress than a home. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she approached the gates, but her resolve only strengthened. The mystery had been buried for long enough. It was time to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of history, and uncover what had truly happened that fateful night. Miss Marple paused just outside the gates, her gaze sweeping over the estate. The whispers, the rumors, the unease of the villagers, all of it swirled around her, making her feel as though the very air was thick with the secrets of the past. She could almost hear the faint echoes of Violet's footsteps in the distance, and she knew, without a doubt, that the truth was waiting for her inside. The mansion's grand facade was a facade in itself, hiding dark corners and untold stories. Miss Marple was no stranger to the silence of a place that held more than it let on, and she would not leave until she had uncovered the truth. It was time for the village of Little Wid to face its past, and for Violet Harrington to finally be found, one way or another. The house where Violet had once lived, now weathered with time, stood hidden behind thick tendrils of ivy, its windows dark and uninviting, offering no clues to the past. It had grown old, like a secret buried deep within its crumbling walls, silent and unmoving. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by Lady Eleanor Lockwood, the widow of the late Sir Reginald, a frail woman now, but her sharp eyes never missed a thing. "You wish to ask about Violet Harrington," she said, her voice deliberate, her gaze piercing. Miss Marple gave a small respectful nod. "It is a name that has been on many lips lately," she replied, watching Lady Eleanor's lips press into a tight line, betraying the hint of unease. "A most unfortunate affair," the widow added stiffly, "but I fear we have nothing to offer." Yet as she poured the tea, her hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying her composed exterior. At the table beside her sat Thomas Lockwood, now a barrister, who leaned back in his chair with an air of studied neutrality. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice distant. "People move on." Miss Marple's smile was soft but knowing. "Indeed," she murmured, "though it is remarkable how the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected." In the corner of the room, the housekeeper, Dorothy Lane, stood quietly, her hands clenched around her apron, her gaze fixed to the floor. She had been with the Lockwood family long before Violet's disappearance, and it was clear from her silence that she carried the weight of secrets older than she cared to admit. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the air thick with unspoken words, the tension palpable. Somewhere in this house, she was certain, lay the truth of what happened to Violet Harrington, and she intended to uncover it. Her next visit took her to Edwin Carter, the village's eldest resident. His home was modest, a reflection of a life lived with quiet simplicity, but his mind was sharp, and his memories vivid. "That night," he began, leaning forward with a sense of urgency in his voice, "I saw something strange." Miss Marple leaned in, her knitting momentarily forgotten, her attention fixed entirely on him. "I was out late," he continued, "checking on my mare. That's when I saw it. A lantern moving in the woods behind Harrington House." His brow furrowed, lost in thought. "At the time I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was one of the stable hands." But Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, as she considered the implications. "And now?" she asked, her voice calm, yet inquisitive. Edwin hesitated before shaking his head. "No one ever admitted to being out there that night," he said slowly. "And by morning Violet was gone." Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. A lantern in the woods at the very moment Violet vanished. Was it a signal, a secret meeting, or something far more sinister? "Do you think the person with the lantern was waiting for someone?" she asked, her gaze never leaving Edwin's face. He paused, his voice low. "I would say they were looking for something." Miss Marple's mind raced. "Looking for what?" she murmured. "Or for whom?" She had learned long ago that sometimes the most useful answers came from those who said the least, and Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper, held more than her share of those answers. Dorothy's presence in the conversation had been minimal at best, but Miss Marple had noticed the subtle tremor in her hands when Violet's name had come up during the village tea. "You must forgive an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple had said, stirring her tea with feigned innocence. "The past, you know, fascinates me." Dorothy had forced a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable. "I prefer not to dwell on it," she had replied, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "But you did." Miss Marple had pressed gently, her tone warm but unyielding. "You trembled when Violet's name was mentioned, and I noticed." Dorothy had clenched her hands around the tablecloth, her fingers pale. "I don't recall," she had muttered. But Miss Marple was not fooled. "Ah, but you do," Miss Marple had countered softly. "You were there that night. You saw what no one else did." Dorothy's breath had hitched, and for a moment, the air in the room had seemed to thicken with the weight of her unsaid words. "It was a terrible night," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Best forgotten." Miss Marple had leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "For some, perhaps," she had said quietly, "but not for everyone." Dorothy had remained silent, her gaze fixed downward, but her silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles still in her lap, turning the small silver locket over and over in her hands. It had been found far from Harrington House, buried in the vicarage garden, miles away from where Violet had last been seen. It didn't make sense, and Miss Marple knew it. There was more to this mystery than anyone was letting on, and she intended to uncover it, no matter where the trail led. The truth, she was sure, was hidden in the dark corners of this village, and with each passing moment, it was inching closer to the surface. The atmosphere in the drawing room seemed to press in from all sides, thick with the weight of unspoken histories. Miss Marple, ever observant, sat still, her sharp eyes tracing the fragile figure of Lady Eleanor Lockwood, once a proud woman, now reduced to a shadow of her former self. The widow's frail hands rested limply on the arms of her chair, her eyes hidden behind the veil of years, though there was an unmistakable sharpness to them that betrayed a mind still keenly aware of the world around her. The house, too, seemed to speak of time gone by, its very walls creaking under the weight of its past, while the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, offering little warmth to counter the cold that had settled deep within the room. The silence stretched between them, an oppressive presence, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "You were here the night Violet Harrington disappeared." Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness, soft but insistent. It was a question, but it lingered in the air like a heavy truth, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly, a momentary flash of something: regret, guilt, perhaps fear, before it was quickly masked by the practiced indifference she had honed over the years. "Time dulls such things, Miss Marple," she responded in a low, almost brittle voice, her gaze drifting to the window, as though searching for an answer outside. "Does it?" Miss Marple replied quietly, her knitting needles clicking with methodical precision, as she watched the woman carefully, noting the subtle signs of strain, the slight tremble in her hands, the rigidity in her posture. For if that were true, this house would not feel so very haunted. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, despite the fire's futile attempts to warm them. Lady Eleanor's face remained composed, but her eyes, dark and distant, betrayed a depth of sorrow and pain that was not easily concealed. She did not respond at first, as if the weight of the question itself was enough to render her momentarily mute. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are things one regrets, Miss Marple," she said, her tone hollow, as though the words were being dragged from the depths of her soul. "Things one carries with them until the very end." Miss Marple, always keen to read between the lines, studied the widow carefully. Her knitting paused mid-motion, as if the very act of creating something, of weaving threads together, was a metaphor for the unraveling truths she was so determined to uncover. "Regret is a curious thing," she said softly. "It does not come to those who are entirely blameless, does it?" The room fell deathly quiet at her words. The widow's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers clutching tighter at the arms of her chair, as though the words had struck a nerve deep within her. Miss Marple could see it, the subtle shift in Lady Elenanor's demeanor, the brief tremor that betrayed a sense of unease that she tried to hide. "I will not speak of it," the widow muttered, her voice shaking with emotion she could not quite suppress. Miss Marple leaned in ever so slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Of course, my dear. It is only that I find it curious," she continued, her voice gentle but laced with an underlying steel. "When one carries such regret, one is often eager to unburden oneself, to speak of it, even to a stranger." The widow's grip on her chair tightened even further, her knuckles pale with the effort. She stood abruptly, the sound of her chair scraping against the floor cutting through the tension like a knife. "You must excuse me," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I am quite tired." Miss Marple, unperturbed, stood as well, her eyes soft but penetrating. "Of course, my dear," she said, her voice a whisper of understanding. "But remember, when one carries a burden for too long, one forgets it was never meant to be theirs alone." The widow froze for a moment, a brief flicker of panic crossing her face, before she quickly turned and hurried from the room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Miss Marple remained in the room, her gaze fixed on the door where Lady Eleanor had just exited. The fire crackled softly, but the room felt colder now, emptier, as though the widow had taken something with her when she left. For a long while, Miss Marple sat alone in the heavy silence, her mind turning over the fragments of the conversation like pieces of a puzzle, each more complex and enigmatic than the last. She knew that something had shifted, something had been revealed, even if only for the briefest moment. The house with its secrets, and the widow with her veiled regrets, were connected in ways that only time would fully unveil, and Miss Marple, ever patient, was willing to wait, knowing that the truth was never as distant as it seemed. It only required the right moment to emerge. Lady Eleanor's silence stretched between them, an unspoken weight heavier than any words could convey. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, but her entire posture seemed to speak volumes, of a history she was reluctant to revisit, of a past too tightly wound to uncoil. Miss Marple studied her intently, her keen sense of observation never failing to catch the tiniest shift in the woman's demeanor. Somewhere deep within these walls, Miss Marple was certain, the truth lay dormant, quietly waiting for the right moment to be set free. She had always believed that a guilty conscience rarely gave itself away through mere words. It was always in the pauses, the way someone held their breath, the slight twitch of a muscle, the hidden flicker of an eye, that the most revealing secrets surfaced. Across from her, Thomas Lockwood, now a respected barrister, sat in the drawing room of Harrington House, his posture relaxed, almost too controlled. His fingers drummed lightly on the arm of his chair, a rhythm that Miss Marple immediately found unsettling, a rhythm too deliberate to be innocent. "Such a long time ago," he murmured, reaching for his tea, his voice smooth, too smooth. "A sad business, of course, but hardly relevant now." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him with renewed intensity. "Curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft yet laced with an undercurrent of something far sharper. "How the past has a way of becoming relevant when one least expects it." Thomas gave a polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose people enjoy their mysteries," he replied, his voice betraying no trace of the unease that Miss Marple could practically taste. Her own smile returned, this time a touch sharper, her words lingering in the air like a slow-moving storm. "Oh, I do think there is quite a difference between enjoying a mystery and being unable to escape one." His fingers stilled against the arm of his chair, the sudden cessation of movement betraying a tension he had worked hard to hide. Violet's locket, found in the vicarage garden. Miss Marple continued, her voice light but her eyes glinting with an unmistakable challenge. It does make one wonder, doesn't it? For a moment, Thomas's smile faltered, the tiniest crack in his composure, a shadow crossing his face as his gaze darted towards the garden outside, though his lips remained frozen in that same polite mask. A coincidence, surely, he replied, but the words were already tainted with an unease that Miss Marple had long since learned to recognize. Lockwood, she countered, her tone still deceptively casual. The most interesting thing about coincidences is how seldom they turn out to be real. She paused, allowing her words to sink into the heavy silence that followed, before she rose from her seat and made her way to a distant portrait hanging in the dim corridor. The painting of Sir Reginald Lockwood, his sharp features rendered with impeccable detail, stood proudly, though it held a disturbing alteration, an empty space beside him, where another figure had once been. How odd, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes tracing the uneven canvas, the edges of the missing figure almost as if they had been deliberately erased. It appears that someone has been removed. Lady Eleanor, standing just behind her, did not reply immediately. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. It was damaged, she said, her words barely more than a breath. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, though her mind raced, each detail adding another layer to the puzzle. Though I wonder, she continued, her gaze never leaving the altered painting, why the damage was so precise. Not the entire painting, just the figure next to Sir Reginald. Lady Eleanor's lips tightened, her composure faltering for just a moment. It is of no importance, she snapped, her voice colder now, more distant. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment longer before she turned, sensing the woman's need for distance, but she knew better than to dismiss such things so easily. That missing figure had once meant something. Someone had made sure of it. Someone wanted that figure to be forgotten. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Harrington House, something caught her attention. A flicker of movement from the servants' quarters. She glanced towards the small hearth, where Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper, stood hunched over the fire. Her hands moved quickly, too quickly, tending to the flames with an almost unnatural urgency. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice breaking the silence like a soft whisper. A rather warm evening for a fire, isn't it? Dorothy startled, though she did not turn to face her. The clutter on the nearby table, old letters, scraps of paper, caught Miss Marple's eye. But the flames, licking hungrily at the yellowed edges of the papers, were what held her attention. She watched as ink smudged and curled, turning to ash. But it wasn't just the fire that intrigued her. It was the way Dorothy's fingers trembled, the way her eyes remained fixed on the flames as if willing them to consume something far more than paper. You know, my dear, Miss Marple said softly, her voice tinged with a knowing calm, there's something rather interesting about the past. It has a most remarkable habit of refusing to stay buried. Dorothy remained silent, her body rigid as though bracing for an impact, but her hands clenched tightly at her sides, told Miss Marple all she needed to know. Secrets, regrets, the past had a way of leaving its mark, and no matter how much one tried to bury it, the truth had a way of surfacing when it was least expected. The fire burned on, but the house, its walls, its people, were slowly revealing their hidden truths. Miss Marple sat back, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she absorbed Margaret Redden's words. The newspaper clipping before them, faded with age, seemed almost like a relic from another time. Yet its message, missing governess, no trace found, was as chilling as ever. It was as if the past was reaching out, demanding to be remembered. Margaret's sigh was heavy, the weight of years of silence pressing down on her chest. She was going to leave Jane, Margaret murmured, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the yellowed paper. That much is clear. Miss Marple, ever the observer, nodded quietly. A resignation letter, written but never delivered. She made a decision, yet something or someone stopped her from acting on it. Miss Marple's words were steady, carrying an undercurrent of conviction. Margaret's brow furrowed, and she chewed on her lower lip in deep thought. Perhaps Perhaps she changed her mind, she offered hesitantly. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together in a rhythm as deliberate as her thoughts. Or perhaps, she replied softly, with an edge of certainty, someone changed it for her. A long silence followed, thick with implication. Margaret's eyes flickered over the clipping again, her mind seemingly racing through the possibility. A young woman, frightened enough to resign, only to disappear before she could act. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Do you know what was in the letter?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. Margaret hesitated, and for a moment, the silence stretched taut between them. "It was never found," she finally confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "By the time the police arrived, it had already been destroyed." The words hung in the air like a cold breeze. "Destroyed, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was low, almost a murmur, but sharp with an undercurrent of suspicion. Margaret nodded, her eyes downcast. "The only person who claimed to have read it was Father Collins," she said, as if the admission pained her. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers now steepled beneath her chin, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. A resignation letter that no longer existed, a confession that had been read and then lost. No, not lost, Miss Marple thought. It had been erased. The dead, she had long realized, often held more answers than the living cared to admit. She turned her attention to the cold, dimly lit church, its high arched ceilings echoing with the memories of countless whispered secrets. The air inside was heavy with the weight of years, as if even the walls held their breath. The stained glass windows cast muted patterns of color across the pews, adding to the atmosphere of reverence, or perhaps in this case, a reverent silence. Reverend Phelps, the current vicar, was seated across from her, his gaze curious, though somewhat guarded. Miss Marple's voice was warm, but purposeful. "I do hope I'm not troubling you," she began, her tone smooth as silk. "It's just that I've been thinking about Father Collins. His rather remarkable memory, to be precise." Reverend Phelps gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "He was a great man," he said, his voice laced with respect, but Miss Marple could detect the underlying distance. "He was trusted by the villagers. A man of faith and duty," she added, her gaze locking onto his with quiet intensity. "Including, I imagine, Violet Harrington's final words." The vicar's smile faltered for just a split second, his eyes darkening before he quickly masked it with another polite expression. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper but insistent. "I understand Father Collins read her resignation letter before it was destroyed. Do you happen to know if he ever recorded his thoughts on it?" The vicar paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. His expression was thoughtful, but Miss Marple could see the internal struggle in his eyes. "He was meticulous," he admitted, his voice softer now, almost nostalgic. "Father Collins believed in recording everything. His thoughts, his reflections. He even wrote about village matters, but those writings were never meant for others." Miss Marple's expression remained impassive, though her mind raced. "And this journal?" she asked, her voice level. "Does it still exist?" The vicar sighed, a heavy, almost resigned sound that betrayed more than he wished to admit. "It's locked away in a cabinet," he explained, his voice tinged with regret. "The key was misplaced after his passing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers absent-mindedly tapping against her knee. A missing key, a forgotten journal, a destroyed letter. Everything about this case was designed to remain hidden. A missing key, a locked cabinet, and a journal that could hold the answers to what happened to Violet Harrington. How very convenient, Miss Marple thought to herself. The past, it seemed, was doing everything in its power to keep its secrets. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage study, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Reverend Phelps leaned back, his face a mask of unease. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with tension, as if the very walls were closing in on them. "Father Collins wrote everything down, didn't he?" she pressed gently, her voice quiet but probing. "Reflections, confessions, his observations. He believed it was his duty, even if he could never share it." The vicar nodded slowly, his eyes flickering to the window, as if seeking refuge in the outside world. Yes, he murmured. He believed in keeping a record of all things, even those that could never be shared. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her voice unwavering. And you believe he wrote something about Violet Harrington? The vicar sighed again, the weight of his own thoughts seeming to press down on him. It would be unusual for him not to, he admitted, almost reluctantly. Miss Marple's fingers gently tapped against the arm of her chair, her mind already piecing together the fragments of this long-forgotten puzzle. And this journal, locked in the vestry cabinet? She asked. The vicar's face seemed to crumple slightly, the frustration evident in his features. It's been there since Father Colin's death. But the key, his voice faltered. It was lost shortly after. And despite our best efforts, we've never found it. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Ah, she murmured softly. A lost key, a hidden journal, a destroyed letter. It seems the past is determined to remain elusive, as if it fears the light. But shadows, she added, her smile deepening, always reveal themselves in the end. We simply have to be patient enough to wait. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the quiet of the room pressing in on her, as her sharp eyes moved from one piece of evidence to another. Every movement, every word, every detail seemed to be a part of a larger puzzle she was carefully piecing together, one fragment at a time. The missing key, the broken seal on the letter, and now the stolen journal. Each of these was like a thread, tugging at the very fabric of the mystery she was determined to unravel. Her thoughts were sharp, deliberate, but she could feel the weight of what was at stake. It was all connected. Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? She mused softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Reverend Phelps, his brow furrowed in frustration, rubbed his temple, clearly struggling to make sense of the strange events. His voice, laced with an underlying weariness, responded with a reluctant nod. I suppose it is, but what can one do? He sighed, his words a mixture of helplessness and resignation. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed, her mind working in overdrive, dissecting every element with precision. In my experience, she said slowly, her words deliberately chosen, when a key goes missing, it is never truly lost. It is taken. Her voice held an edge of certainty that seemed to make the very air around them tense with anticipation. The vicar's expression shifted slightly, his eyes widening, as the realization of her words settled in. Someone had taken the key because they knew exactly what lay within that journal, and they had waited 30 long years to ensure its secrets remained hidden. The weight of that knowledge hung heavy in the air, thickening the silence between them. The night outside was unnaturally still, the quiet that lingered in the village streets almost palpable, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. It was the kind of silence that came just before a storm, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around your chest and refused to let go. Miss Marple, though outwardly calm, felt the tension tightening within her. She knew this was only the beginning. Then, as if on cue, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Margaret Redden, her face pale and anxious, stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, as though trying to shield herself from the chill that had suddenly filled the room. The church, she whispered, voice barely audible but filled with urgency. Someone's broken in. Without hesitation, Miss Marple stood and moved swiftly to the door, her sharp gaze already assessing the situation. The scene had changed in an instant, the quiet of the village now broken by a new, ominous development. Within moments they were at the vicarage, where Reverend Phelps stood, his face drained of color, as though the very foundations of his belief had been shaken. The cabinet, he said, his voice heavy with disbelief, as if he still couldn't quite understand what had happened. It's been forced open. The room inside was cold, the scent of splintered wood mingling with the chill of the night air, making it feel as though something fundamental had been broken. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the scene with quiet precision. The cabinet door hung loosely on its hinges, its contents in disarray. It was clear that someone had been looking for something they knew was hidden there. Reverend Phelps moved quickly, his hands shaking as he searched through the cabinet, rifling through papers and objects in a frantic attempt to find what had been taken. After a long moment of desperate searching, he turned to them, his face now ashen. "The journal," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's gone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The journal, the last known account of Violet Harrington's final days, had been taken. Someone had waited decades for this moment, to remove it from the church, and now it was too late to stop them. The implications of this discovery were immense, and Miss Marple knew that they were only scratching the surface of a much darker truth. The next morning, the village was alive with gossip and speculation. A break-in at the church, a stolen journal, and a truth that had been buried for so long, it seemed determined to stay hidden. The whispers in the streets were thick with curiosity and fear, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the village's uncertainty pressing down on her. She sat by the window at Redfern House, her knitting lying untouched in her lap, as her eyes studied the quiet street below. The village, still and serene on the outside, was a far cry from the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. Margaret, pacing the room with her usual restlessness, finally spoke, her voice tinged with confusion and frustration. "I don't understand, Jane. Who would risk so much for something so old?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted from the street outside to Margaret, her eyes clear and knowing. She didn't need to answer right away. Margaret's question was one she had already considered deeply. "A person who understands," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice soft but firm, "that time does not erase guilt. It only buries it deeper." The words seemed to linger in the air, heavy with meaning, as Margaret's expression faltered, the weight of the truth dawning on her. "But the police," she began, her voice uncertain. Miss Marple raised a hand, her calm demeanor silencing the young woman's concerns. "My dear," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable authority, "the police look for criminals. What we are dealing with here is a conscience, a guilty conscience." Margaret shivered, the thought sending a chill down her spine. "You think the person responsible is still in this village?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple's smile was small but full of knowing. "I do not think it, Margaret. I know it." Her gaze was steady, unwavering, as she looked out the window once more, her mind already a few steps ahead, piecing together the puzzle. Because whoever took that journal wasn't just erasing history. They were erasing themselves from it. The night came quickly, casting long shadows over the village. Miss Marple found herself once again by the window, watching the stillness of the garden. It was a silence that was not peaceful but suffocating, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Her knitting lay forgotten once more, as her sharp eyes caught sight of a movement in the darkness. A figure, barely visible, flickered between the hedges of the vicarage garden. Then the unmistakable glow of a lantern, cutting through the cold night air. Someone was out there, searching, digging, looking for something. Miss Marple's breath remained steady as she watched the figure move with purpose, pausing occasionally to glance over their shoulder, ensuring they weren't being followed. This was no ordinary villager out for a late-night stroll. This was someone who had come with a singular purpose. The figure paused, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she heard the distant sound of a dog barking, followed by the faint shuffle of feet against the earth. The shadow stiffened, then vanished in an instant, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the armrest, her mind racing as the pieces clicked together. This was the same place where Violet's locket had been found, and if someone was still searching after all these years, it could only mean one thing. There was something else buried in that soil. By morning, she knew she would uncover the truth. The next day, the village was quiet, but Miss Marple knew the truth would not remain hidden for long. Armed with nothing more than a garden trowel, and her unwavering determination, she knelt before the disturbed earth near the vicarage hedge. She had always believed that truth, much like seeds, had a way of resurfacing when one least expected it. And now, as she carefully dug into the soil, She knew that it was only a matter of time before the past would rise again, revealing its darkest secrets. Miss Marple stood still, her hands trembling, ever so slightly as she turned the worn leather glove over in her fingers, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail. The soft hum of the morning air was suddenly suffocating, a quiet tension hanging between her and Margaret. The dirt on the glove was easy to dismiss, but the faint stains beneath, dried blood, dark and unmistakable, spoke volumes. A chill snaked down her spine despite the warmth around them. "It seems Violet Harrington never truly left Margaret," Miss Marple murmured, her voice low, but carrying a weight that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just the glove, or the locket found earlier. It was the truth that had lain dormant for 3 decades, now clawing its way to the surface, defying time and decay. Margaret stared at the glove, eyes wide with disbelief, her breath catching in her throat. Could it really be? Could this be proof? She whispered, her voice shaking with the enormity of the realization. Miss Marple paused, the world around them still as the morning sun bathed the garden in golden light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the past itself. "Yes," she said softly, her fingers brushing over the bloodstains. "This is no coincidence, my dear. The glove, the locket, all of it." She turned the glove in her hands once more, the fabric worn and creased, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but her voice wavered as she asked, "But why bury it here? Why hide it in the first place?" Miss Marple straightened, brushing the dirt from her gloves with methodical precision. "Because," she said, her tone sharp and matter-of-fact, "some things are never meant to be found. And yet, here it is, out in the open. A clue, long hidden, now uncovered. Proof of a dark truth that has remained buried too long." A sharp breath escaped Margaret's lips, a mixture of awe and horror. But who buried it? Who wanted this to stay lost? Miss Marple gave a small knowing smile, but there was no humor in her eyes. "That, my dear, is the question we must now answer." The sound of the glove being placed down upon the table in front of Thomas Lockwood echoed in the room, a jarring contrast to the polished silence of Harrington House. He glanced at it, dismissing its significance with a slight wave of his hand. "A glove," he said with a thin, practiced smile. "Hardly the sort of thing to hold any real importance, don't you think?" Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on him, her voice soft but cutting through the air like a blade. "I think, Mr. Lockwood, that sometimes the most insignificant pieces of evidence tell the greatest stories. This glove may not be a clue yet, but its very existence will be the one thing that keeps us on this path. That, Mr. Lockwood, is what makes it important." His facade didn't crack, but the faintest tightening of his jaw told her everything she needed to know. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, a small triumphant smile playing at the corners of her lips. As they walked outside into the crisp autumn air, Margaret caught up with her, voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't seem to care much about the glove, did he?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "No, my dear, he didn't." Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Do you think?" Miss Marple's expression hardened, her voice low but firm. "People don't dismiss things unless they have a very good reason to make them disappear. The glove, the letter, the journal, they're all connected. Every trail leads back to the same truth. Violet Harrington knew something, and for 30 years, someone has been desperately trying to erase that knowledge. But now the erasers are starting to wear thin, and the truth is beginning to show itself." The weight of her words hung in the air as the two women continued on, their steps echoing in the quiet streets. In the distance, the crumbling stables at Harrington House awaited their turn to reveal the secrets they held. The stables, long abandoned, their beams sagging under the weight of history, seemed almost alive in their silence, as if they too were waiting for the past to be uncovered. And as Miss Marple stood there, her hands folded in front of her, the cold touch of the stone beneath her fingers reminded her that some mysteries could not remain hidden forever. The stables, the crumbling mortar, the years of decay, they were all part of a story that had been silenced, a story that would not stay buried much longer. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was the only one who could hear its call. Miss Marple stood quietly, her gaze fixed on the crumbling stone wall before her. An unusual spot for a hidden chamber, she mused, her voice soft but carrying a weight of unspoken understanding. Inspector Graves, a man whose mind had been trained on clear-cut cases, let out a long, controlled breath. If you're right, Miss Marple, this could be the answer we've been searching for. With a final shove, the last brick gave way, revealing a hollow space behind it. The air that escaped was thick, stagnant, laden with the smell of long-forgotten years. And then, as the faintest light filtered into the hidden room, they saw it, the crumpled remains of a body, a skeletal form barely clinging to the decayed fabric of what had once been clothing. The outline of Violet Harrington was unmistakable. Margaret Redden gasped, her hand shaking as it reached out to grasp Miss Marple's arm. "It's her, isn't it?" she whispered, voice quivering. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from the scene before her. "Yes, my dear," she said, her tone steady. "Violet Harrington never left this village. She was here, hidden in plain sight, silenced by someone who feared the truth she held." Margaret recoiled, as if the very notion of it all was too much to bear. "But why here? Why the stables?" she asked, her mind grappling with the unimaginable. Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if it held the final piece to a puzzle only she could see. Her fingers grazed over the remnants of an old chair, a lantern half fallen beside it, and something far more significant, a small silver chain tangled in the fabric of Violet's sleeve. With practiced precision, Miss Marple lifted it from the debris, revealing a pocket watch, its engraving still visible despite the wear of time. "Not Violet's initials," she murmured, "but someone else's, someone erased from history." Her eyes met Margaret's, filled with the quiet certainty that only Miss Marple could possess. "Henry Lockwood," she said softly, "the missing brother from the Lockwood portrait. Violet found something dangerous enough to silence her. And now, 30 years later, the truth is ready to speak, whether someone wants it to or not." In the study of Harrington House, Inspector Graves paced before the fire, frustration etched across his face. "So that's it then," he muttered. "Sir Reginald Lockwood killed Violet Harrington. The motive's unclear, but the evidence suggests he buried her, and the truth along with her." Miss Marple sat, calm and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Yes, Inspector," she replied, her voice unwavering, "but it doesn't end there." Graves shot her a puzzled look. "What do you mean? The man's been dead for 15 years. How can we find justice now?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened slightly, her voice as sharp as ever. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Inspector. Sometimes it's about the truth finally emerging from the shadows." Graves ran a hand through his hair, clearly unsatisfied. "And yet the case dies with Sir Reginald, doesn't it?" he asked, his voice tinged with resignation. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes held a flicker of something more. "No, Inspector," she said softly. "It did not die with Sir Reginald." Her gaze flickered to the door, a knowing look crossing her features. "Because the true accomplice is still very much alive, and the mystery, the heart of it all has yet to be uncovered." Silence filled the room, heavy with expectation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled over them. Inspector Graves stood frozen, his brow furrowed, unable to comprehend what he had just been told. Miss Marple, as ever, simply waited, her mind already working through the puzzle, as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with a heavy silence that clung to every corner of Harrington House. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and calculating, never wavered as she regarded the inspector. "A secret buried for 3 decades, she mused softly. "Not the work of one person, I suspect." Margaret shivered, her breath catching. "But who else, Jane?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Miss Marple's voice, calm and unwavering, filled the stillness. "Someone with access to this house, someone who understood the art of keeping secrets, someone who had a reason to protect them." Her words hung in the air, and it wasn't until the inspector's gaze flickered toward the door that Miss Marple's next sentence broke the silence. "Oh, Inspector, I'm not just speaking of someone still in the village. I mean someone who has been within these very walls among us, all along." The atmosphere shifted, no longer weighed down by the quiet, but thickened with an almost palpable tension. Margaret's hand found Miss Marple's, her grip tight with the sudden realization that the truth had been staring them in the face all along. "You already know, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of anticipation. Miss Marple gave a small knowing smile. "Yes, my dear. I've known for quite some time." Margaret swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. "But why haven't you said anything?" she asked, her voice strained. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her gaze never leaving Margaret's. "Because, my dear, people often reveal more than they realize when they believe no one has discovered their secrets." The inspector's shoulders stiffened. "So you're suggesting the person responsible is still here, in this house?" Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression calm, but her words sharp. "Indeed, Inspector. The time for silence is over." She rose, the soft rustle of her skirts the only sound in the room. As her gaze shifted toward the doorway, she turned toward the shadow that lingered just beyond it, her voice soft yet filled with the authority of truth. "It is time for a confession." In the final chapter, there was no frantic pursuit or dramatic escape. There was only the weight of a secret long hidden, its final toll now to be paid. Dorothy Lane sat in the sitting room of Harrington House, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes cast downward. She did not need to meet Miss Marple's gaze. The truth was too clear, too undeniable. Miss Marple settled across from her, her knitting now forgotten in her lap, her voice as soft and gentle as ever. "It must have been exhausting, keeping such a secret for 30 years, she said, her words cutting through the silence. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat, and her hands tightened around her apron. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. But even she knew the lie would not hold. Miss Marple's tone remained steady, almost soothing, but there was no mistaking the force behind her words. "You do, my dear. Carrying the weight of Violet's death, of the lies you've told, it must have been unbearable." Dorothy remained silent, but her fear was evident. Miss Marple's voice was patient, her eyes never leaving Dorothy's. "It was you, wasn't it? You helped him. You made sure Violet never spoke the truth." Dorothy's fingers began to tremble as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she stammered, her words faltering under the weight of her own guilt. Miss Marple nodded, understanding, but her gaze was unyielding. "No, my dear. I don't believe you did, but the consequences were no less severe." Dorothy's voice cracked as she spoke again, her words barely audible. "I thought it was over. I thought no one would ever find her. I thought it would stay buried forever." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression gentle yet firm. "But I found her, my dear, and so has the world." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes as she gripped the arms of her chair, the heavy weight of 30 years of silence crashing down on her. Miss Marple allowed her a moment of silence before she spoke again, her words like a soft sigh. "It was never just about Violet, was it?" Dorothy shook her head, her breath ragged. "No," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing with quiet understanding. "Sir Reginald had a brother, Henry Lockwood, a man whose name was erased from history, his very existence wiped from memory." Dorothy inhaled sharply, her lips trembling. "He was a disgrace to the family," she whispered. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but resolute. "And Violet discovered the truth. She wasn't supposed to, but she did." Dorothy nodded, her breath shaky. "She wanted to tell someone," she confessed, her voice breaking. Miss Marple sighed, the full weight of the tragedy finally sinking in. And so she was silenced. She finished softly, her gaze steady, as Dorothy's tears fell freely, her confession now complete. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and with it, the long-buried truth of Harrington House was finally brought to light. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. And yet, despite the years that had passed, it felt as though the walls of Harrington House had been holding their breath, waiting for the truth to surface. Dorothy sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the flickering candlelight, as if the shadows themselves could offer her a reprieve. The tension was palpable, each breath she took shallow and labored, the burden of 30 years pressing down on her frail shoulders. She could still hear Sir Reginald's voice in her mind, cold and commanding, telling her that it had to be done, that Violet had to be silenced before she could ruin everything. It was a lie, she now knew. A lie wrapped in layers of fear and guilt that had festered in the dark corners of her mind. Miss Marple, always patient, always observant, had been watching her for some time, and now, with the soft click of her knitting needles, the older woman's voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension like a blade. "It must have been terribly exhausting, my dear," she said, her tone gentle, almost sympathetic. Dorothy's lip trembled, her hands shaking as they twisted the fabric of her apron. She didn't want to face it. She didn't want to admit that for all these years, she had been complicit in a lie so large that it had swallowed her soul. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. But the words felt hollow, empty, as though the weight of her own lies had stolen their meaning. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "No, dear, I don't think you did. But here we are." The old woman leaned forward, her voice lowering into a near whisper, the words cutting deep. "It was you, wasn't it? The one who helped him. The one who made sure Violet never spoke again." Dorothy froze. The truth was now laid bare. The thing she had hidden for so long finally exposed to the light. The past, as it often does, had risen from its grave, and now there was no escaping it. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could almost hear Violet's voice, her scream echoing through the halls of the house. The girl who had known too much. The girl who had found the secret that Sir Reginald had worked so hard to bury. "I didn't want to do it," Dorothy said, her voice cracking. "But she found out. She saw him. Henry Lockwood. She recognized him. I thought. It was over." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. But when she confronted Sir Reginald, her words faltered, as the memory came flooding back. The horror of that night, the blood, the fall, the silence that followed. Miss Marple's eyes were calm, but her words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "He didn't plan to kill her, did he?" Dorothy shook her head, her tears falling freely now, a river of guilt and regret pouring out. "No, he didn't. But when she threatened to expose him, when she said she would tell the world about Henry, about everything, her voice broke, and she choked on the words. She fell, hit her head. The blood, it was everywhere." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unyielding, and then the silence began. Dorothy's shoulders slumped as the truth settled over her like a shroud. For 30 years, she had lived with the weight of it, a secret buried so deep that even she had forgotten the surface of it. But now it was out in the open, raw and exposed. The guilt, the shame, it was all there, too real to ignore any longer. "I helped him," Dorothy whispered, the confession tumbling from her lips like a dam breaking. "I helped him hide her. I thought if I never spoke of it, it would disappear. But it never did. It never will." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Silence doesn't erase the past," she said quietly. "It only makes it fester." The truth had been spoken, the secret laid bare, but the pain of it would linger forever. Dorothy's hands gripped the arms of her chair, as if trying to anchor herself to something, anything, to stop the world from spinning out of control. She had been loyal. She had thought she was doing the right thing. But in the end, loyalty to the wrong person had been her prison. The weight of it had been crushing. Margaret, who had been watching quietly from the window, finally spoke, her voice low, almost hesitant. "So he killed her. He did it to keep the secret safe." Dorothy nodded, tears spilling down her face. "Yes, he did. And I helped him. I helped him bury her, keep her hidden for all these years." Miss Marple stood, her knitting now forgotten, as she watched Dorothy, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. "The past cannot be erased, my dear," she said softly. "But now at last, you are free." Dorothy lowered her head, her face a mask of sorrow, but in her eyes, there was something else, something like release. The truth had come, not with a bang, but with a quiet, suffocating weight. And as Miss Marple left the room, the sun beginning to set outside, the shadows of old crimes hung heavy in the air. A voice called out from the village gate, a familiar figure standing there, watching the old detective with knowing eyes. Some crimes never die, do they, Miss Marple? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Miss Marple adjusted her hat, and gave him a small knowing smile. No, she replied softly, but neither does the truth. With that she walked away, leaving behind a village forever changed by the secrets of the past.